Thank you very much, and I'm very glad there is no dress code here since I came without a tie. It's a pleasure and an honour to present this afternoon, and also to meet up with some old friends. We were trying to work out whether it was 20 years in terms of Bill and also Jerry. It's also a pleasure to have the opportunity of, in a way, offering a catch-up for those of you who had a very similar lecture, but not the same, at the British Nepal Society last year. Since then, we spent 2 months in November and in December in Kathmandu, excavating mainly within Hanumandoka, but also working at Pashupati. At the bottom, I've put those who I must not forget. We are hugely supported by the Government of Nepal, Department of Archaeology, Ministry of Culture. On the far left, we had a grant for November, December from Arts and Humanities Research Council. There is a new fund called the Global Challenges Research Fund, and we were given an award to cover part of the work. National Geographic also supported the work, and we were delighted to get a grant from their conservation fund. Normally, it's allocated to support and protect tigers in Nepal, but we were very glad that for once we were able to look at the protection of monuments. And also we work very closely with Pashupati Area Development Trust, who are the managers of Pashupati Nath. So I did not intend originally to work in Kathmandu. I am an archaeologist of South Asian archaeology, and particular have specialized in the archaeology of Buddhism. And as Alan very kindly mentioned, I worked at Lumbini for UNESCO, running a series of excavations, working on the site, trying to fit it for what we call sustainable pilgrimage, for the steady rise of Buddhist pilgrimage to Lumbini in the face of infrastructure that's going on there. That included 3 years of rather exciting excavations inside the Temple of the Buddha's birth at Lumbini, where in the very base of that we recovered evidence of an early timber shrine dating back to the 6th century BC under the floor of the living temple. Now, for us, for our team, every year it would mean we'd arrive into Kathmandu, spend a couple of days in Kathmandu, and go straight down to the Terai, in a way missing one of the architectural gems of Nepal. 1979, 5 sites within the Kathmandu Valley were absorbed into a single World Heritage Site. And they are mainly 17th to 18th century constructions, unique ensemble. The blurb at the bottom is taken from the UNESCO World Heritage Site. But it's this unique development of the pagoda style. This, of course, is Patan Durbar Square. Before you get an idea that these are empty museum pieces, they are living monuments. And indeed, the intangible threads through the tangible with the bricks and the mortar and also the tile. This is in Hanumandoka, and this is Lord Ganesh going on a circumambulation brought by his devotees around the monuments. These are living monuments. Each of the temples actually acts as the portal to another world, but where one can actually have influence on the terrestrial world. So they are not dead sites, they are very much living sites. Now, almost exactly 2 years ago, in 2015, there was a major earthquake, 7.8 on the Richter scale, close to Gurkha, which hugely affected Kathmandu and the surrounding area. Now, it was a human tragedy, 9,000 people killed, livelihoods destroyed across this huge belt of area. And I do not mean by focusing on the monuments to belittle that impact. This is the scene, though, of Kasthamandap, hours after the earthquake. This is the eponymous building of Kathmandu, the building that gave its name to Kathmandu, and it is rubble. This was the World Heritage Site. And here you can see army, you can see volunteers, all trying to pull the 90 people from the rubble who were killed there because it was a temporary blood donation camp. Hours later, the army mobilized JCBs, and here are some of the images 3 hours later of JCBs and bulldozers. They cleared as much as they could of the monument. They recovered the bodies as well. Then UNDP gave a contract to a series of international refuse disposal experts who, with bulldozers, with JCBs, cleared out the streets. So actually, mobility was once more ensured. Individuals then cleared the smaller streets. This is Kasthamandap again, a week later, and the local inhabitants actually are living in temporary camps on top of the old monument because they're too frightened to live in their houses because of the aftershocks. In Pashupatinath, many of the buildings were so badly damaged, people were worried with the aftershocks they would come down and injure. Here's a photograph of the army actually pulling down some of the monuments. Where did the material, which before the earthquake was protected by Nepali law and international law, UNESCO World Heritage status, ancient material, it ended up on the back of trucks, driven out of the Durbar squares and dumped. Some of it dumped in central Kathmandu, some of it dumped in landfill. Now, I know to my cost, because we're commissioning conservation down in Lumbini, one brick of the quality costs £1.40 to buy. If you think of the millions of dollars worth that were dumped in those first few weeks at the behest of UNDP with the concept of just clearance, this was a catastrophe. If you add to that the environmental elements of actually having to fire brick with timber, actually it exemplifies it. Much of the timber was salvaged, and there are squares piled to the ceilings with timber, which specialists are very steadily going through, trying to allocate them back to individual monuments. Because when the earthquake happened, it was a Saturday. Offices were closed. So actually, this was mainly people power, communities coming together to try to protect. As ever in Kathmandu, life goes on. This is Hanuman Doka. This is the Hanuman statue. This is a rather wonderful construction of scaffolding to protect this main deity. And as you can see, life goes on. And indeed, for an archaeologist who deals mainly in brick, in stone, in monuments, this is the remains of the Kasthamandap, rubble, and actually the intangible gives it meaning to the community living there. Their traditions, their beliefs. Here is Lord Ganesh, again going on circumambulation, actually give value to the monuments which collapsed. That's the immediate aftermath, and the damage in terms of preservation of life, on recovery of the dead, no one can question. My colleagues and I began to then notice other things happening that we began to think should not. Now, many of the sewer lines were fractured, many of the water lines were fractured. Here is Pashupatinath, and here is a JCB that's just cut a storm drain straight through the site. Here is the photograph in the bottom. For those of you who are not trained archaeologists, I put this handy red mark because that actually is a Lichvi period wall down below. This is buried below years of debris, but actually in putting in this drain, they've cut right through archaeological material, and indeed lingams were being hauled out. This was all done at night, so there was no officer from the archaeology department. Again, destruction. This is in Hanumandoka, and so engineers and architects began to start planning the rebuilding. So here we have, actually, this is a soil core, drilled into the soil, often cutting through water pipes, leading to subsurface flooding, in trying to work out more about liquefaction so they could then start the planning for rebuilding. Architects, many of whom I know and respect, then went to the site. When they saw bulging walls, they thought, wouldn't it be interesting to dig a hole? So they dug a hole. Often those holes were then left for weeks without filling. And also, as an archaeologist, this is destruction. All excavation is destruction. Without recording, it is complete destruction. None of these archaeological sequences, and you can see brickwork below, were ever recorded. So this was just destruction. No professional archaeologists were involved at this stage. This is one of the very sad examples. This is Kasthamandap, which is in Durham Square. And over the last 2 years, I've taken photographs as the conservation has gone on. This is supported by World Monument Fund and also supported by the American Ambassadors Fund. Now you can see progress as it goes on. The rubble's been removed, all of the material inside's been removed, and then the entire monument's been removed, and then it's been rebuilt. The archaeological deposits within, which record the history of that monument and its adaptation to the seismic zone, are counted as trash, and they were just dumped without any archaeological recording. And then this, sadly, was taken even more recently. This is a Lichvi period shrine. All of the archaeology has been dug out, all of the walls have been dug out, no recording, rebars put in, concrete poured on top, reconstruction. This as well, if you talk to structural engineers with experience of earthquake, this is a disaster waiting because it just has so much rigidness within it. Next earthquake, it will be guaranteed to come down. Now, Bodnath, which many of you recognise, the tower at Bodnath and the spire, the worsened cracks, the entirety was taken down, no archaeological recording, no dating, and concrete and rebars added on top. So the next time there is an earthquake, the bricks are set in mud mortar, and on top there is this massive weight of concrete. Again, community-led, but a disaster. The focus, and there is $2.7 billion for reconstruction. The point that we've come to labour as a group of colleagues, of architects, engineers and archaeologists, is the focus is on reconstruction of the skyline of Kathmandu, not actually how that skyline bonds to the history of Kathmandu. And this, we believe, is a second cultural catastrophe. Now, when we began to see this, we began to contact colleagues in the Department of Archaeology, Government of Nepal, and they were very clear, we need some help in urban archaeology and rescue archaeology because of capacity shortages. So we got funding from, at that time, UNESCO, and we had support from the government of Nepal to put a small team for 6 weeks to actually try to give an exemplar of what information was being lost and what we could reconstruct. First point we wanted to demonstrate was when you look at the Durbar squares, and this is back to Bor, you shouldn't think of them as being always empty spaces. Our hypothesis was actually these spaces have opened and closed over time, dependent on disasters and opportunism of various rulers and builders. Here is Manju Singh from the Department of Archaeology with a ground-penetrating radar. Ground-penetrating radar is spectacular because it actually can identify structures below the surface, so it's perfect for brick pavements. These are the exciting results. You can see a series of linear lines, and this is a slice at 1.1 metres below the surface. These are actually modern pipes and drains, but this area, so this is where Vatsala is, this is where the palace is, this is where the museum, you can see some very, very regular lines. Those are walls less than a metre under the surface. So actually, far from being an empty space, this was a very busy space in the past. Here is the view with all of the supporting framework on the left at the museum. This is Oldfield's view. So actually, it shouldn't, this was an easy win. It shouldn't be a surprise that we have buildings there, because actually Oldfield recorded this building, the Lamupat, which was a legal office, which came down actually in the 30s and was never replaced. But what we wanted to demonstrate was when people were recutting to lay pipes and sewers, all of this is value archaeological data. So here we can you can see some of the foundations of the building. Here is our rather beautiful L-shaped trench with a series. This is the frontage of that building, running along here, 17th building, 17th century. This is the collapsed Vatsala. So this was a superb exemplar to demonstrate that actually we should be really careful, because these are water pipes here running straight through the archaeology, damaging and destroying the past of Kathmandu. What we did was we created for the major Durbar squares a series of risk maps using traffic lights for ease. Red means there is an archaeological building, please do not put pipes or sewer lines through this. A yellow, which is possibly modern, and indeterminate. So to try and guide, to work with the engineers and also the administrators of the city, not delaying humanitarian infrastructure, but actually working with them for that. The second point we wanted to identify was that when we look at a building like the Vatsala, we often have a very simplistic view of it in its final stage. So this is Vatsala, again in Bhaktapur. And Vatsala was this rather beautiful stone-clad building. It's meant to be 17th century. When we arrived in October 2015, this was what was left of Vatsala. The shikara had completely collapsed. So we excavated. The first thing we found was actually the shikara, the stone of the shikara, is a later addition to the monument. Actually, all of that hides within it an earlier brick-built structure. And when they put on this cladding and that high shikara, actually they didn't damage the internal brickwork, they just popped the stone up to it, no bonding. Undoubtedly, this is why it's come down in 1930 as well as 2015. More than that, and this is photogrammetry to ease the speed of recording, we found that it was built on top of a series of earlier structures, and actually occupation in the Durbar Square dates back to the 1st century BC. So actually we're able to push back the history of Kathmandu and its urbanization that much earlier as well. And this is the traditional view, so all of those magnificent books on the architecture of Kathmandu, you get up to here. They're all superstructures. So what we're trying to do now is work with the architects using the archaeology to predict actually the foundations which underpin them. Because how can you safely and successfully reconstruct without knowing at all what the foundations are like? Our second question was one of demonstrating adaptation and resilience. Yes, the majority of the buildings are 17th century, but actually, how did the pagoda style result? What are the earlier prototypes? This is now a shift to Hanumandoka, and this is Kasthamandap. So here's another beautiful image from Oldfield. And Mary Slusser, one of the great art historians of Kathmandu, wasn't sure, maybe 12th, maybe 13th century for the date of the Kasthamandap, the eponymous monument of Kathmandu. And others like Bernier have suggested 16th century. As I said in the introduction, the building came down on the day of the earthquake, killing 90 people. The army then sent in the bulldozers. Now we know the bulldozers actually removed 30% of the monument's foundations because the operators from the army had no knowledge of the footprint of the building. So now we know actually the paving was very thin on top of earth fills. So when the digger blades came down, they went straight down into the foundations, pulled back. 30% of the building is entirely destroyed. In October 2015, this is what we were faced with. how do you do an excavation? How do you begin to understand and to work with engineers and architects? How do you rebuild? How do you join old material to old foundations? What was left of the foundations? So for 6 weeks we worked there, and this is all we had to go from. Corn, Sistini, these are their plans. A plan of 4 brick coins at the corners, and you can see absolutely no knowledge about the foundations. How deep are they? How strong are they? The entirety of the building rests on 4 pillars at the centre, which are about 5 meters 60 high. They support the entirety of the monument. They are key. So if you need to reconstruct, we needed to know what was left of the building. So the key was actually what were the foundations at these 4 key points. This is what we did. We, in true archaeological fashion, put a trench right into the centre, working with our colleagues. And what we picked up was actually the centre was defined by what we predicted to be a massive brick foundation measuring 12 metres by 12 metres, 2 metres deep, 1 metre wide, a massive foundation brick set in a mud mortar, which now we understand actually has a flexibility so that within an earthquake it passes vibrations through rather than fracturing. And in the centre, we were interested to know what supported these 4 massive pillars. So we started clearing off the rubble. We recovered material from the people who had been killed there. All of that material we recorded and collected and also presented to the archive. Here you can see this is part of the damage from the JCBs and the bulldozers. This part of the monument was completely stripped out. You can see some of the saddle stones have been stripped out, and you can see how repetitively those blades have cut down onto the monument. Here is the photograph of the edge. This damage, again, is all bulldozers. But then we found actually what supported those 4 timber pillars, actually a huge brick pillar. 2 metres deep, 1 metre by 1 metre. If you look very carefully, there is no earthquake distortion to that pillar. So actually, the adaptation is magnificent. And these are later bridged by these small buttresses, which also, interestingly, create a mandala. On top of that sits the saddle stone, and then the timber sorts in. Now, we were able to track down the 4 timbers, one of which had to be cut with a chainsaw as part of the recovery, but as you can see, they are massive. This lock is into that saddle stone. This is how the timber flexibility of the superstructure meets that massive foundation below. And also, there's a tiny bit of gap between this and the bottom of the cut in the saddle stone so that any moisture collects down there. Now, we had a puzzle when we cleared all the rubble because we had 1 saddle stone there, 1 saddle stone there, 1 saddle stone here, and there was a missing saddle stone that we couldn't quite explain. There was only tile. This tile was put down in the 1960s in one of the major conservations. But actually what you see is the tile is slightly distorted. And we began to hypothesize in the 60s, perhaps actually one of the pillars had rotted at the bottom and maybe they just shoved tile underneath. Now, interestingly, when we looked at the 4 pillars again, sure enough, the bottom of one of them is rotted and has had evidence of a repair. But we weren't sure because we'd run out of time and money to continue on that project. With funding from National Geographic, from the government of Nepal, and also from Arts and Humanities Research Council, we went back and we spent the entirety of November and December last year. We came back on the 21st of December, and in a team working with Tribhuvan University, Lumbini Buddhist University, and the Department of Archaeology, we actually decided to excavate the entirety of the monument in order to understand how it was constructed and therefore how it can be reconstructed. So we have a series of time lapse going through the different periods. This is the removal of the 1960s paving. Below is Rana period floor. Then we get back to probably a 17th or 18th century flooring, bits of stone flooring there, carrying on going down in time, and this is the original monument. Now, what is really exciting about this monument is this is one of the fullest plans we have of the monument, but also, if you can look, now we have dates for the monument. The monument was first built in 700 AD. So when you read about articles which suggest that vernacular Nepali architecture failed in the 2015 earthquake, actually this building has been standing since 700 AD. 200 years later, actually these bracing walls were added, which add both a bracing to these four central pillars supporting the main superstructure, but also they create a cosmic space. They create a mandala. This is a mandala with 9 units within it. And then to our surprise, we found actually there is an additional mandala right in the center of the monument. In terms of earthquake damage, there is almost no earthquake damage to the monument. And even these fills seem to be artificial fills that have been designed, a mixture of muds and clays, to actually give a buffering to the vibrations of earthquake. And also, right down at the bottom, we have evidence of occupation in this area, 1st, 2nd century BC. Now, in a way, this is pushing back the history of Kathmandu, but also pushing back the origins and the development of the pagoda style. Now we have this beautiful sequential model of how the monument developed. Also, we targeted in November and December the strange case of the missing saddle stone. So here you can see we're steadily removing the tile, and the saddle stone is appearing below the 1960s tile, and here it is in its full beauty. What's also interesting, and this project is actually unearthing evidence of earlier technological adaptation. This is actually part of bronze, it's about brass, it's about 90% copper, and what it does is this was a plate. This is a plate to keep moisture coming up from the foundations and affecting the timber. So this is a sort of waterproofing. When we excavated it, we actually found that missing bottom of the pillar. This is the repair. So actually the building had been repaired, a new tenon had been fitted in, and actually this is a copper shoe that was nailed over the tenon. So the building actually had been repaired, there was clear maintenance. The timber is still in there. So we've now taken samples for radiocarbon dating, so we can even reconstruct not only the construction phasing of the foundations, but also the phasing of later repairs. When we removed that, we were rather excited to find gold, which, as an archaeologist, actually very seldom found. But these are gold, and actually they're about that size. Sorry. These are gold mandalas, and we found gold mandalas in each of the 4 pillars in the saddle stones. So actually, not only do we have this cosmo-magical creation of the 9 units, but even within the 4 pillars, we have these mandalas. Much of the scientific work is done by my faceless colleague there, Professor Simpson from the University of Stirling. And here he is taking a core from the timbers. So actually we can get an idea of the date of the pillars, again to get an idea of, we know the age of foundations, this way we will actually then begin to know how old are the timbers, the beams, what are the traditional cycles of maintenance and reconstruction. If we can understand those, actually hopefully we can avoid tragedies like the collapse. Here he is doing some OSL dating, optically stimulated luminescence dating. Here is the portable XRF in the field, which can give you a very clear understanding of whether a metal is copper, whether it's lead. We've been working with Annie Joshi, who is an architect, a specialist in timber, who's been looking at the timber to see which parts of the monument, which parts of the timber framework actually broke, so we can understand more about resilience. And also building up a very good idea of the foundations to the superstructure, and then joining the superstructure to a knowledge of the foundations and the ideal adaptation to this seismic area. We had another ambition. We only went to work on Kasthamandap, but we were given a series of other temples to work with the Department of Archaeology. Close to Hanumandoka is Jaisi Dewal. This is the monument after the clearing of the superstructure. And actually, this is one of the traditional monuments, which is one of these stepped temples. No one actually knew what the construction phasing were of these. Now we know, because we've looked at 2 or 3 of them, they all begin with a massive brick plinth in the centre, standing up to 4, 5, 6 metres high, absolutely monolithic. All of the terraces next to them are actually quite haphazard. Perhaps they are later additions, or actually perhaps they are designed to absorb earthquake mobility. We don't know yet. This case was actually built on top of a paved courtyard. So actually, again, these open areas ebb and flow over time. Here is the Director General of Archaeology. Here is the Director of the National Archives. And there you can see very clearly no earthquake damage again in these core constructions. Same with Jagannath and Gopinath. And this is a rather sad slide because this is reconstruction only 10 years ago. This is all modern construction, all of the archaeological phasing, the adaptations of how we've reached these final stages had been ripped out during the conservation and no record made. So what we're trying to do is persuade architects and engineers this is significant. We've also been going around taking images of what are called earthquake archaeological effects, because the entirety of the modern catalogue is based on Greco-Roman architecture in the Mediterranean. There is nothing from the Kathmandu Valley or from South Asia. So we've been going through actually trying to link up to understand, can we identify earthquakes in the past as well? For example, at Guruju Satal, this building in Pashupatinath had collapsed. We were very interested in trying to find evidence of earthquake damage from earlier earthquakes. Actually, this is earthquake damage. This is where a stone saddle supporting timber uprights has actually resulted in distortion and a series of linear cracks. So we're able to start dating earlier earthquakes in the valley. We had an ambition as well of capacity building. So we trained archaeologists from the Department of Archaeology, Government of Nepal. We trained archaeologists from students from Tribhuvan University, because one of the clearest things was there was little capacity after the earthquake. Actually, the post-disaster needs assessment, culture, identified that the Department of Archaeology needed 20 new engineers, needed 15 new architects, of course it needed 10 new accountants, it needed 2 new archaeologists. When actually, this was what we were trying to do, to demonstrate that we needed more. We also raised funds, and we brought archaeologists from Myanmar, from Sri Lanka, and also from India to join and actually start understanding some of the very key, simple aspects of earthquake archaeology. Now, as I said at the beginning, a lot of the damage to the monuments was actually inflicted unknowingly by the first responders, the army and also the police. So when we worked in Pashupatinath, which many of you will recognize from this slide, we decided we would do an experiment, a live exercise. This is Guruju Satal, which, for those of you who might remember, this is the western gate to the temple. It was a 3-story, pretty traditional Nawari structure, a satal, a resting place for sadhus. It came down in the earthquake, and it had been left just as a pile of rubble. So we thought we would train police, members of the Nepali army from the disaster management battalion from Nepal police and from the armed police force not in archaeology, but post-disaster recovery. So they came to the site, and we started working with them to create not a methodology to be used by archaeologists, but to be used by first responders, one that had to be quick, but also one that did not focus on the dumping of material that could then be reused. So with them, we worked up a methodology of laying out simple grids, of then duplicating those grids elsewhere, but close by, and then of simply recording material, putting it into sacks linked to each of the grids, photographing. We said in a disaster, you can only use your mobile phone, you don't have a fine archaeological scale, you use a shovel. All of that material was uploaded, and then you dump the material because you can't process. Top priority is clearing. You dump the material, you later process it. And also, core to this, you reclaim what you can, because each one of these bricks is worth £1.45. So you avoid this huge bottleneck, environmental disaster, and huge waste of income as well. And also, you record material that might help you actually recognize identity at a later step. Now, it's interesting because we've been through NATO advice for post-conflict archaeology, the sorts of advice given to first responders, Army, Blue Shield. There is a huge tome of about 109 pages, no images. Actually, what we wanted to do was create a really simple, transferable plan. And also, we gave the officers the responsibility of uploading their notes every night onto a closed Facebook site. And here is our first cohort who graduated. We trained them for 10 days, then for 2 weeks, we left them on their own, observing, not correcting, and actually it was phenomenally successful. Now we're working with them to create a series of phased handbooks, illustrated handbooks, to actually guide people on how they can protect. The outputs of our work we're publishing in ancient Nepal, because it's only 50 rupees. It's immediately accessible to many people. We are sending our reports, our formal reports, to UNESCO. And also, we're publishing because we need to convince architects and engineers that they need, our mantra is look down, not up. And so we're writing in popular architectural magazines in Kathmandu. And also, actually, it's the politicians, the community leaders. So we've held series of open days, explanations. Here's Comrade Rohit at Bhaktapur. And here is the MP, Madhulakshmi at Hanumandoka. And community, because actually the community have to accept the findings if they want to rebuild. Many of the community are fascinated by the results and the response that actually there is nothing wrong with vernacular architecture. It's questions of maintenance. And on the last day we're in Kathmandu, 600 monks and nuns came to reanimate the archaeological site, to actually return it back to the community, to also quieten those who died at the site, and also to prepare for the reconstruction. Now, you might think, is that it? Actually, I'm going to indulge myself for just jumping now to the other end of South Asia, because the Sri Lankan archaeologists who were there were so interested in the post-disaster archaeology, they have now asked for a post-conflict training in Jaffna Fort. Now, on the right is the old Portuguese fort, 1618. On the left, the very fine Dutch fort built with, as you can see, all the science of European military. There is Jaffna, coming out of almost 40 years of civil war, and this spectacular Dutch fort, which was one of the largest in the East Indies. This was taken in the summer. Here you can see these are the fine fortifications of the Dutch fort. Here is an early engraving of the great Dutch church, the governor's house, the barracks and the hospital. This is it today. 109 days it was besieged. This is what's left. Now, in order to bring tourism to the area, in order to understand history of the area better, the government of Sri Lanka are working with Jaffna University to excavate. So we're going there in June to actually undertake more post-conflict training to see if the methodology developed in Kathmandu can be transferred. That was all that was left of the Dutch church. This is all that's left of the governor's house. And interestingly, or for me, there was a latrine shaft cut at the back of the Dutch governor's house. And from that, they recovered Dutch pottery, Portuguese pottery, further down Chinese pottery, further down Islamic pottery, and also Roman contact material. So there's also this opportunity to reposition Jaffna Fort, not just as a place of death and of conflict, but actually as a cosmopolitan trading point. The Portuguese and the Dutch were there for trade, before them, contact with the broader Indian Ocean world. And so we're working with Jaffna University and the Central Cultural Fund, Government of Sri Lanka, funded by the British Academy as well, to try to bring a better history, a more representative history of Jaffna to it as well. Thank you very much.
Some questions for Robin.
Bimsem Tower, what's happened to that?
Bimsem Tower is, as you know, down.
Yes.
In my view, it should never be rebuilt.
Okay.
It has collapsed every time. There were 2 towers, it's come down again and again and again. It was a tragedy, but for the amount of money and technology, really what is the point of reconstructing? Kasthamandap actually is the eponymous monument of Kathmandu. Bimsem Tower, and you talk to the community around Kasthamandap, they are wholeheartedly supporting its reconstruction in a vernacular style. Bimsem Tower, it was never successfully resilient there. Why rebuild it?
Okay, that's very interesting, because Britain Porcelain raised some money with the idea of doing, and there's been a bit of a hoo-ha. Thank you for that, because I will then recommend that we then do it. Yeah. We send it to Kasthamandap, but we're better.
I mean, honestly, Kasthamandap is going to engage local craftspeople.
Okay.
It's the timber working, the brick working. It's also relearning those traditional techniques.
Okay.
That is going to bind the community back together in a way that Bimsem Tower was always an extraordinary monument.
Thank you.
Yes, any more questions?
Did you ever find any of the bricks? Did anybody find in the landfill that you talked
Many of the bricks have now just been dumped into foundations for buildings. So there was no campaign I suppose, processing that material. So in some places like Pashupati, there have been some campaigns, but no, it's gone. It's gone now, which is one of the economic and financial tragedies we want to avoid, because now there is a bottleneck for bricks that can be produced of that quality. So sadly, they've been dumped.
Yes.
Robin, thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating. To go away and
I know you have a much larger grant, though, so you'll be able to do far more.
The thing we're calling the Bimsem Tower, because it's a whole other story, which is equally interesting, but also very different. But 2 particular questions. One was the question of why the Kasthamandap had collapsed, and really whether you're attributing that to that poorly repaired fourth column, because that's kind of the popular
Yeah.
understanding. And the second one was when you were talking about the history of these structures, you made a sort of teasing reference to the possibility that it might give you some idea of when the pagoda style
Yeah, in terms of the two questions, and Bimsem Tower, I'm not dismissing. I'm just questioning in terms of the aesthetic and also purpose, really. In terms of the pagoda style, as you are aware, there are many people who have many different hypotheses for creation of pagoda style. Professor Tawari is a regular visit to our excavations and is very keen on actually understanding more about the dating and the process. My view is actually Kasthamandap is now without doubt the earliest of the monuments which we can call a pagoda style that we have archaeological independent evidence for. Now, the Chinese pilgrims, you might be able to glean some suggestions that there are pagoda-like structures. And working as I do in the Terai, you look at some of the monuments, Kodan, etc. Well, what's a pagoda, what's not a pagoda? But Kasthamandap is actually the only monument I'm comfortable with in terms of independent dating. But then again, we're really interested in the scientific dating because now we'll have dating for the foundations, we'll have dating for the construction of the cross walls. We've got these samples from the different timbers as well, so we can actually begin to relink to that traditional style of maintenance, which for us is key because one of the things that is absolutely clear when you go round the wood piles in Hanumandoka is the number of timber members which have just cracked, split. Now, timber is very weak immediately, which is why you season it, and then it becomes systematically stronger. Then it suddenly weakens again. So actually, traditionally, as we have at Kasthamandap, there are interventions for maintenance and conservation. It's trying to understand that earlier mechanism, which undoubtedly the removal of the independent city-states, etc., has in a way juxtaposed or interposed. And in terms of your second question, which is on why it came down, at the moment, we're working with people to try and get some models together from our foundations. One of the challenges is that there is $2.7 billion available for reconstruction. There is nothing, apart from our £93,000 grant from AHRC and then the National Geographic Fund, for what is termed research. This that I've shown you today is classified as research. Now, my view is this is rather more than research. If we were working in the area covered by the Cultural Protection Fund, we would be able to go and seek funding for that. But this is research. Therefore, we find ourselves in this hole where we are having to beg for the analysis of the mortar, because the mud mortar is the key to the monuments. You need to keep it moist, but not too moist. That is the key to the mortar. So we have to get more material, more data from, that's why we took out the portable XRF for the material, because the material normally is classified as silt. Actually, now we know from the scientific printouts, it's not silt. It's actually a concocted menu for that monument. So actually, yes, there are a number of treatises on how to create a monument, and we're working with Nina Meerning from the Austrian Academy of Sciences in terms of the Sanskrit treatises on how to construct, to see to what extent that actually interphases. But so far, we've been unsuccessful in getting enough money to work with the structural engineers to do the modelling, because that's what we really want to do. Because what we have is the fourth of the main timbers that actually has no connection to the foundations, and we've also found others where they've just been cemented over or tiled over. So we have about 6 points in the monument where there is no linkage between the superstructure and the foundations. And undoubtedly, that is a major contributing factor. And maintenance.
Robin, you mentioned that after all this, they put this trellis work in and then concrete on top of it to this like. You know, it's obviously too late to do anything now about that. But I mean, have they been trained thereafter this thing to prevent that happening in the future? Or something?
There are clear guidelines. So after our first mission, we worked very closely with the Ministry, very closely with the Department of Archaeology to create guidelines. The issue is one of enforcement, capacity, and basically knowledge as well. Our work on Kasthamandap has led to a position where the local community now have rejected one or two attempts to dig holes and put in steel for the reconstruction. And their view is they want to now raise the funds to reconstruct it as the exemplar. The other sites, every time I see it happening, for me, it is a second cultural disaster. But until there is more capacity, more funding, because none of the donors are interested in research. They are only interested in reconstruction, and it will continue.
Bill?
How much does the tiered pagoda style owe to Tibet?
In terms of archaeological data, I can very easily say that actually the amount of dating we have available is almost negligible within Tibet for construction. So at the moment, and this is purely an artifact of, in a way, the disaster, because it gave access to sites as a sort of an ancillary, we just have such poor understanding of both construction and also dating. You know, what is absolutely clear is the whole of that Himalayan belt, you have an adaptation of timber from valleys of Gilgit, Chitral. You know, you see that bonding of the timber, which gives a flexibility. But even there, what would be interesting to see, how is it linked into the foundations? But at the moment, the earliest absolutely dated example we have is Kathmandu 700. What's interesting is that period is late Lichvi, and that's a period that's meant to be no particularly strong king, something of an unquiet period, but actually it's a period where one of the major constructions is built in Kathmandu that then continues as a key monument. Its authors, sadly, even archaeology cannot help us with that.
Right, Bill, can I ask Bill Woodburn, please, if you would mind giving a vote of thanks to you, Robin?
Well, thank you so much indeed. That was one of the most fascinating talks I've ever heard in this society. Beautifully clear, beautifully illustrated, and said with such enthusiasm. And one of the things that came out to me was, it wasn't just the archaeology, though that was absolutely fascinating, it was the people. You were able to show, right from the word go, that these things mattered to people, the pilgrims that were still coming to the ruins and everything else like that. Yeah. You were also able to show what you've done to try and then motivate people to look after these things in the future. You're young enough, I hope, for your guidelines
not now.
to become a really important international factor in restoring not just earthquake damage, but I'm afraid war damage. My mind was going to Aleppo and places like that, where all similar sort of things are going on. Good luck with it, Robin, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much.